cold mead dripped from the shattered silver goblet. Yet Gideon felt nothing of the chill. Hidden beneath the heavy mahogany table sat a terrified heartbeat wrapped in wild honey, and his inner beast immediately shattered all restraint to roar a single possessive command: mine. The winter of 1482 was unforgiving, burying the northern fortress of Ethelgard in 6 feet of snow and ice. Inside the great hall, however, the heat was suffocating. King Gideon of House Valerius sat at the center of the high table, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked beneath his beard. He was the Alpha King, a man whose reputation for brutality on the battlefield was matched only by his icy demeanor in court. Tonight was the feast of the winter solstice, a mandatory gathering of all the northern lords, and Gideon despised every second of it. To his left sat Lord Roderick of Ashbourne, a bloated, cruel alpha whose wealth was the only reason Gideon hadn't severed his head from his shoulders. Roderick was currently boasting about a recent acquisition, a rare breed of hunting hounds, he claimed, though his eyes gleamed with a sickeningly familiar cruelty that suggested he wasn't talking about dogs. Gideon tuned him out, staring at the roaring hearth. His inner wolf was restless. It had been pacing at the edge of his consciousness for hours, agitated by the claustrophobia of the hall, the clashing scents of alpha pheromones, and the suffocating perfume of the courtiers. He didn't know that mere inches from his heavy leather boots, a desperate girl was holding her breath. Her name was Isolde. Just 3 hours prior, she had been chained inside a reinforced iron carriage belonging to Lord Roderick's caravan. Omegas were rare in this brutal age, often treated as myth, and those who were discovered were rapidly commodified, sold into breeding contracts, or kept as trophies by powerful alphas. Isolde was a runaway, a girl who had spent the last 5 years rubbing her skin raw with crushed wolfsbane and wet ash to mask her natural scent. But Roderick's trackers had caught her near the borderlands, when a wheel on Roderick's carriage had shattered on the cobblestones of Ethelgard's outer bailey. Isolde had taken her chance. She slipped her bindings using a rusted nail she'd hidden in her hem, darted through the chaotic kitchens, and, in a moment of pure, blinding panic, scrambled into the great hall before the doors were sealed. With nowhere else to go, she had slid beneath the heavy velvet drapery of the high table. For 2 hours, she had huddled on the cold stone floor in the dark. She was starving, her ribs bruised, her wrists bleeding from the iron cuffs. Above her, the booming voices of the most dangerous men in the kingdom reverberated through the wood. She could see the boots of the Alpha King himself, heavy, reinforced with steel. If she made a single sound, she would be dragged out and executed for trespassing, or worse, handed right back to Roderick. But the sweltering heat of the hall was undoing her only defense. The mixture of mud and wolfsbane she had hastily smeared over her pulse points was cracking. Sweat beaded on her neck, washing away the ash. Above, Gideon suddenly stopped chewing his bread. His hand, which had been resting on the hilt of his dagger, went perfectly still. His inner wolf, which had been snarling in low, irritable circles, suddenly stopped. It stood at attention. A scent had just cut through the overwhelming stench of garlic, stale ale, and sweaty armor. It was faint at first, the scent of rain-soaked pine. Then a rush of wild honey and something deeply, inherently sweet. It hit Gideon's senses like a physical blow to the chest. It was intoxicating. It was pure. It was an omega. Gideon's amber eyes flared, bleeding into a luminescent gold. The chatter of the lords around him became muffled, like he was under water. He inhaled sharply, his chest expanding, tracking the pheromones. It wasn't coming from the crowd. It was coming from below. Beneath the table, Isolde shifted her weight, trying to relieve the cramping in her legs. Her elbow brushed against a discarded bone, knocking it against the stone floor with a sharp clack. It was barely a whisper of a sound, but to an alpha's ears it was thunder. Gideon's goblet slipped from his fingers, clattering against his wooden plate and spilling dark red wine across the linen. The table went dead silent. Lord Roderick paused mid-sentence, looking at his king in confusion. "Your Grace, is the wine spoiled?" Gideon didn't answer. The beast inside him was violently clawing at the surface, threatening to shift him right there in the middle of the hall. "Tch," the wolf snarled in his mind. "Ours, mine," slowly, deliberately. Gideon pushed his heavy oak chair back. The scraping wood echoed in the suddenly quiet hall. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the high table. Ignoring them all, the Alpha King reached down, grabbing the edge of the heavy velvet tablecloth, and ripped it upward. The light from the roaring hearth flooded the dark space beneath the table. Isolde gasped, throwing her arms up to shield her face. She was a pathetic sight, covered in soot, wearing rags that were barely holding together, her bare feet bruised and bloody. She scrambled backward like a trapped animal, hitting her back hard against the wooden modesty panel of the table. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the killing blow. Instead, a massive, scarred hand reached out. "Come here," a voice rumbled. It wasn't a request. It was an alpha command, steeped in so much power that the very air in the room seemed to vibrate. Isolde's omega instincts, buried beneath years of trauma and survival, violently betrayed her. Her body went limp, submitting to the sheer force of the command. Trembling violently, she lowered her arms. Gideon stared at her. Beneath the dirt and the grime, he saw wide, terrified emerald eyes. He felt the terrifying magnetic pull of the mating bond, locking into place, wrapping around his soul like iron chains. He didn't just want her. He needed her to breathe. He wrapped his massive hand around her fragile upper arm and pulled her out from beneath the table. Gasps erupted throughout the great hall as King Gideon hauled the filthy, trembling girl to her feet. The lords and ladies of the court murmured in shock. Assassins were common, but a beggar hiding under the king's own table? It was a massive breach of security. The royal guards instantly drew their broadswords, the ring of steel echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Stand down!" Gideon roared, his voice layered with the resonant, bone-rattling timbre of his wolf. The guards froze, lowering their weapons instantly but remaining tense. Isolde swayed on her feet, the sudden light and the overwhelming scent of the king making her dizzy. Gideon was massive, easily standing 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders clad in dark leather and fur. His golden eyes were locked onto her, dilated and feral. His hand was still wrapped around her bicep, his thumb brushing against her skin. Where he touched her, it felt like a branding iron, yet it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Who are you?" Gideon demanded softly. The question meant only for her. Before Isolde could force her paralyzed vocal cords to work, the screech of a wooden chair being violently pushed back shattered the moment. "By the gods!" Lord Roderick spat, stepping around the table. His face was purple with rage. "You little rat!" Gideon's head snapped toward Roderick, his lip curling back to reveal elongated canines. He instinctively stepped in front of Isolde, shielding her small frame behind his massive one. "You know this woman, Roderick? Know her?" Roderick let out a harsh, barking laugh, though his eyes darted nervously to Gideon's bared teeth. "She is my property, Your Grace, a runaway slave. My men have been tearing the courtyard apart looking for her. I apologize for the intrusion. She is a deceitful, feral little thing. I will take her off your hands immediately and have her punished for disturbing your feast." Roderick reached out to grab Isolde's wrist. He never made contact. With blinding speed, Gideon's hand shot out, catching Roderick by the throat. The Alpha King lifted the heavy armored lord off his feet with a single arm. Roderick choked, his face turning from purple to a mottled blue, his hands desperately clawing at Gideon's iron grip. Panic erupted in the hall. Ashbourne knights reached for their hilts, but the king's royal guard instantly flanked them, spears leveled at their throats. "She is an Omega," Gideon snarled, his voice dropping an octave, shaking the dust from the rafters. He leaned in, his glowing eyes burning into Roderick's terrified ones. "And you have her in iron cuffs. You dare bring a slave trade into my kingdom, Roderick? You dare traffic my kind in my home?" She was unclaimed," Roderick gasped out, spitting blood as Gideon's claws dug into his neck. "Legally, mine by right of salvage." Isolde trembled behind Gideon, clutching the fur pelt of his cloak. The scent of his anger was intoxicating, like a thunderstorm rolling over dry earth. It made her knees weak, but it also made her feel something she hadn't felt in 5 years. Safe. "She is not unclaimed," Gideon said. His voice was deadly quiet now, carrying across the silent hall. He dropped Roderick, who collapsed to the stone floor, coughing and gagging, clutching his bruised throat. Gideon turned back to Isolde. The feral rage in his eyes softened, melting into something deep and fiercely protective. He reached out, his bloody claws retracting, and gently cupped her dirt-streaked face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "She is mine," Gideon announced, not looking away from Isolde's wide, emerald eyes. "She is the Queen of the North." The great hall erupted into absolute chaos. Alphas shouted, goblets were smashed, and the political alliances that had held the Northern Kingdom together for a decade threatened to snap in a single second. Claiming a slave as a mate, let alone an Alpha King, claiming a runaway as his queen, was unprecedented. It was political suicide. Roderick staggered to his feet, flanked by his men. "You cannot do this, Gideon. She is legally bound to House Ashbourne. This is an act of war." "Then let it be war!" Gideon roared back, the Alpha command forcing several weaker men in the room to their knees. He turned to his captain, a scarred warrior named Kyle. "Escort Lord Roderick and his men out of Aethelgard. If they are still within my borders by sunrise, slaughter them all." Kyle slammed his fist against his chest plate in a salute. "With pleasure, my king," as the guards forcibly dragged a screaming, cursing Roderick from the hall. Gideon turned back to Isolde. The adrenaline of the moment suddenly crashed down on her. The starvation, the fear, the overpowering bond of the alpha mate. It was too much. Her eyes rolled back, and her legs gave out. Gideon caught her before she hit the floor, scooping her effortlessly into his arms. She weighed practically nothing, a realization that made his chest ache with a violent, protective fury. He carried her out of the great hall, ignoring the frantic questions of his advisors trailing behind him. He didn't care about the impending war with House Ashbourne. He didn't care about the winter treaties. As he carried the unconscious Omega up the winding stone stairs to his private chambers, Gideon knew only one thing. He would burn the entire continent to ash before he let anyone touch her again. But as he laid her on his bed and carefully washed the dirt from her wrist to tend to her wounds, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Beneath the grime and the scars on her inner forearm was a birthmark, a crescent moon pierced by a sword, the royal crest of the Eastern Plains, the bloodline that was supposed to have been entirely eradicated by Roderick's forces 20 years ago. His new mate wasn't just a runaway Omega. She was the rightful heir to the largest kingdom on the continent and the biggest threat to every reigning king in the realm, including him. The heavy oak doors of the king's bedchamber clicked shut, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the quiet room. Isolde gasped, her eyes snapping open. She scrambled backward against the massive, fur-strewn four-poster bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The suffocating iron chains were gone. The biting cold of the winter courtyard was replaced by the radiating heat of a roaring fireplace. But it was the scent that grounded her, a rich, enveloping aroma of rain-soaked pine and wood smoke. It was the scent of the Alpha King. Gideon stood by the hearth, staring into the flames. He had stripped off his heavy leather armor, wearing only a linen tunic that clung to the broad, scarred expanse of his shoulders. In his hand, he held a warm cloth, stained with the soot and dried blood he had carefully washed from her skin while she slept. "You are awake," Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a shiver down Isolde's spine. He turned to face her, his golden eyes locking onto hers. The feral intensity was still there, but tempered by a profound, cautious gentleness. "Do not fear, little wolf. No one will ever put you in irons again. You have my word as king." Isolde swallowed hard, her throat raw. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am nothing. A runaway, a beggar. You risked a war with House Ashbourne for a shadow." Gideon closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, sitting on the edge of the mattress. The mattress dipped under his immense weight. He reached out, his massive fingers gently taking her left arm. He turned her wrist upward, exposing the inner forearm where the dirt had been wiped away. "You are no shadow," Gideon said softly, tracing the exposed birthmark with his thumb. The crescent moon pierced by a sword. "I know this crest. It belongs to King Henry of the Eastern Plains, a man whose entire bloodline was supposedly butchered by Roderick's mercenaries 20 years ago." Gideon's eyes lifted, meeting her terrified emerald gaze. "Tell me your true name, Omega." Tears welled in Isolde's eyes. For 5 years, she had buried her identity beneath mud, wolfsbane, and the constant, crushing terror of discovery. But staring into the eyes of her fated mate, the walls she had built shattered. "My name is Isolde," she breathed, the confession tasting like blood and ash. "Daughter of King Henry. I was hidden in the crypts when Roderick's men breached the palace. I watched them slaughter my pack. I have been running ever since." Gideon's jaw clenched, a low, menacing growl vibrating in his chest. The knowledge that Roderick had hunted her, had chained the rightful queen of the East like an animal, sent a surge of lethal, protective fury through his veins. "Roderick did not know who you were," Gideon concluded. "If he knew he had the true heir to the East, he would not have brought you to my banquet. He would have executed you to secure his stolen lands. He will know now, Isolde said, panic edging into her voice. He will realize why you claimed me. He will march on Ethelgard. You must let me go, Gideon. If I stay, your people will bleed for my existence. Let them, Gideon snarled, the alpha beast rising to the surface. He leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers, breathing in the intoxicating scent of wild honey. You are mine. The bond is sealed in my soul, Isolde. I do not run from war. I welcome it. By dawn, the fortress of Ethelgard was a hive of frantic, lethal preparation. Gideon stood at the head of the heavy obsidian table in the war room, flanked by his trusted captain, Kael, and the loyal Lord William, a grizzled veteran of the border skirmishes. The map of the northern kingdom was spread before them, wooden markers denoting the approaching threat. Roderick is moving faster than anticipated, Lord William reported, his thick finger tapping a red marker near the frozen pass. He has called upon his banners and paid off the southern mercenary companies. They will be at our gates by tomorrow's eve. Gideon scrutinized the map, his mind working with cold, tactical precision. To ensure Ethelgard's survival, he had to weigh the brutal mathematics of war. We are outnumbered 3-1, Kael muttered, his brow furrowed. And Roderick's men fight without honor. Our scouts report they are carrying silver-tipped arrows. A single volley could decimate our front line. We will not meet them in the open fields, Gideon commanded. He pointed to the narrow ravines surrounding the fortress. We implement the choke point strategy. Defense directives. Tambazum. The vanguard. Kael will lead a contingent of heavily armored alphas to bottleneck Roderick's forces at the Whispering Gorge, neutralizing their numerical advantage. The archery corps. Lord William will station the archers on the high ridges, raining fire arrows down on the mercenary supply wagons to freeze their advance. The Royal Guard will remain within the inner bailey to protect the keep and the Queen. It is a sound strategy, Your Grace, William said hesitantly, but morale is fractured. The lords are whispering. They do not understand why we bleed for a runaway slave. She is not a slave, the voice rang out, clear and resonant, slicing through the heavy tension of the war room. Gideon, Kael, and William turned toward the arched doorway. Isolde stood there, bathed in the pale winter sunlight. She was no longer wearing the rags of a captive. The royal maids had dressed her in a gown of deep emerald velvet, lined with white direwolf fur. Her dark hair was braided back, revealing the sharp, aristocratic lines of her face. She looked every inch the Queen of the East. Gideon's breath caught in his throat. His inner wolf preened with possessive pride. Isolde walked to the table, her emerald eyes locking onto Lord William. I am Isolde of the Eastern Plains, daughter of Henry, rightful heir to the sunken throne. And I will not hide in the inner bailey while this pack bleeds for me. She looked at Gideon, the mating bond pulsing fiercely between them, granting her a strength she hadn't felt in years. Roderick's army is built on fear and gold, Isolde said, her voice steady. But there are Eastern lords in his ranks, men who were forced to bend the knee to Ashbourne when my father fell. If they see me, if they know the bloodline of Henry survives, they will turn their cloaks and slaughter Roderick's mercenaries from the inside. Gideon stared at his mate, awestruck by her fierce, unyielding spirit. The terrified girl under the banquet table was gone, replaced by a warrior queen forged in fire. Then you will stand by my side, Gideon declared, a vicious smile playing on his lips. We will show Roderick what happens when he wakes the wolves of the north. The evening of the solstice brought a blizzard that swallowed the sky, plunging the world into a howling, freezing whiteout. The fortress of Ethelgard stood like a jagged black crown against the snow. Below, the valley floor was a sea of torches. Lord Roderick's army had arrived. From the high battlements, Gideon looked down at the sprawling encampment. The air was thick with the stench of burning pitch, wet fur, and the metallic tang of impending bloodshed. Beside him stood Isolde, wrapped in a heavy, cloaked mantle, her hand resting on the stone parapet. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from the electric hum of the battle to come. "I is deploying the trebuchets," Kael yelled over the roaring wind, pointing to the massive wooden siege engines being assembled in the distance. "Let him waste his timber," Gideon growled. He turned to Isolde, his golden eyes glowing in the darkness. He reached out, pulling her flush against his chest. The embrace was desperate, a silent vow between mates. "Do not leave this wall, Isolde, no matter what happens." "Come back to me," she whispered, gripping his armor. "Promise me." "I am yours," Gideon vowed. "Death itself could not keep me from you." Gideon stepped back, throwing off his heavy cloak. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the beast within. The transformation was violent and breathtaking. Bones cracked and realigned, muscles expanded, and within seconds, the Alpha King was gone. In his place stood a monstrous, midnight black timber wolf, standing waist-high to a man, its eyes burning like twin suns. The great wolf let out a guttural, bone-shaking howl that pierced the blizzard. From the courtyard below, 4,000 northern wolves answered the call, a deafening chorus of lethal intent. The gates of Ethelgard groaned open. Gideon led the charge, a black shadow erupting into the white snow, his pack surging behind him like a tidal wave of fur and fangs. The clash was catastrophic. Gideon hit the front line of Roderick's mercenaries with the force of a battering ram. Jaws snapped, armor crunched, and blood sprayed hot and red across the snow. The bottleneck strategy at the Whispering Gorge worked flawlessly. Roderick's superior numbers were useless in the narrow pass, their ranks folding under the ferocity of the winter-born wolves. But Roderick was a coward who fought dirty. As Gideon tore through a line of spearmen, a loud twang echoed from the ridge. A volley of silver-tipped arrows rained down from hidden ashbourne archers. Silver was the bane of their kind, burning through werewolf flesh like acid. Several northern wolves fell, howling in agony. Gideon dodged, but a silver bolt clipped his massive shoulder, tearing through fur and muscle. The burning agony sent him crashing into the snow. High on the battlements, Isolde saw her mate fall. The mating bond in her chest seized, a phantom pain ripping through her own shoulder. "Gideon!" she screamed, the sound lost to the wind. Below, Roderick emerged from the mercenary ranks. I was heavily armored, wielding a silver-forged broadsword. He marched toward the wounded, struggling black wolf, a triumphant, sadistic grin twisting his features. "The great Alpha King," Roderick sneered, raising his blade. "Dying for a whore of the East." To Isolde's vision tunneled. The trauma, the fear, the years of running. It all evaporated, replaced by the ancient, dormant power of her royal bloodline. Omegas were rare, not because they were weak, but because their magic was the very heart of the pack. They were the anchors, the healers, the unyielding soul of the wolves. Isolde climbed atop the stone parapet, ignoring the shouts of the royal guards. She threw off her hood, exposing her face to the biting wind, and drew in a massive breath. She did not shift. She didn't need to. Isolde let out a scream that shifted into an ethereal, resonant howl. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated Omega command, a frequency that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the soul of every werewolf on the battlefield. With the howl came a wave of pheromones, thick and sweet, carrying the absolute authority of the Eastern royalty. The effect was instantaneous. For the northern wolves, the scent was a rush of pure adrenaline. The burning pain of their silver wounds vanished, their muscles flooding with renewed, terrifying strength. But for the Eastern lords trapped in Roderick's ranks, it was a revelation. They recognized that scent. They recognized that command. It was the scent of their true king, Henry, living on in his daughter. "The princess lives," an Eastern commander roared from the enemy flanks, raising his sword. "House Montgomery is alive! Death to Ashbourne!" Chaos erupted in Roderick's army as a third of his forces instantly violently turned on the rest. Alphas they had marched beside. The tide of the battle inverted in a matter of seconds. Roderick froze, looking back at his fracturing army in absolute horror. "No! Hold the line, you traitors!" The distraction cost him his life. Fueled by the overwhelming power of his mate's command, Gideon pushed through the agony of the silver. The black wolf lunged. Gideon's massive jaws clamped down on Roderick's throat, crushing the armor and the windpipe in one sickening crunch. Roderick's broadsword fell to the snow. The corrupt Lord of Ashbourne choked on his own blood before going perfectly, permanently still. Seeing their leader fall, the remaining mercenaries broke ranks and fled into the blizzard, hunted down by the vengeful eastern and northern wolves. The siege was broken. The war was over. Hours later, the great hall of Ethelgard was quiet, the fires stoked high to banish the winter chill. The air was thick with the scent of healing herbs and victory. Gideon sat on the edge of his bed, his shoulder heavily bandaged, human once more. Isolde knelt before him, her hands gently resting on his knees. She was covered in snow and soot, but to Gideon, she was the most radiant creature the gods had ever forged. "You saved my life," Gideon murmured, his hand reaching out to cradle her cheek. "You saved my entire kingdom." "We saved each other," Isolde replied softly, leaning into his touch, her emerald eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am no longer running, Gideon. I am home." Gideon leaned down, capturing her lips in a fierce, possessive kiss. The mating bond, forged in blood, terror, and triumph, snapped fully into place, a brilliant tether of light binding their souls together for eternity. He pulled her up, wrapping his massive arms around her, burying his face in the crook of her neck to breathe in the scent of wild honey and pine. The Alpha King had found a beggar hiding under his table. But when the winter sun rose over Ethelgard the next morning, it illuminated not just the northern fortress, but the dawn of a unified empire. The tyrant of Ashbourne was dead. The east was reclaimed, and seated upon the iron throne, holding the hand of her fiercely devoted mate, was Isolde. the Omega Queen who had howled an army to its knees. Did this fierce tale of destiny, betrayal, and unbreakable mating bonds keep you on the edge of your seat? The Alpha King and his Omega Queen proved that true power lies in unity and courage. If you loved this immersive werewolf romance, don't forget to smash that like button, share it with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more epic, pulse-pounding stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a twist.